Two roads diverged in the yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how a way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, this, of course, is a poem by Robert Frost. I'm sure most of you probably have heard this at one time or another. Why am I reading this to you? Because I want you to start to think a little bit differently about international relations and the role of actors. And I want you to think a little bit about this poem as I ask you a few questions that I've written down. First, what difference do elections make if the distribution of power and structure of the international system determines the behavior of states? If, as Thucydides argues, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, what difference do individual actions make? If the way states behave has to do entirely with one state becoming weak and another state taking advantage of it, then clearly anything that occurs at the domestic or individual levels must not matter. States are unitary, right? And they're rational. That means they all behave according to the same motivations. Power maximization to ensure survival. Kill or be killed. All states do this. So answer this. Do elections, or for that matter, do the actions of individuals matter, especially in terms of foreign policy and in terms of international behavior? Well, think about it. If a state is like a car, doesn't a car need a driver? Now, cars don't get in accidents on the highway by themselves. Drivers make mistakes, or they go on road rage, something like that. Can't a leader make a difference? Do countries behave differently depending upon the leaders? Consider this. If someone other than Bush were president, would we necessarily have invaded Iraq? If George Washington were president today, would we necessarily have the same outcome? Now, what's more important, military balances or the beliefs of a president? Who's in power or where a state is located? Does a leader's philosophy affect outcomes? For example, we can look back at Richard Nixon, who was a realist. Carter was a liberal/idealist. However, did not different leaders result in different beliefs and thus in different policies? Now, all of these questions can be answered with a decision-making approach. It assumes that decisions are made by leaders, and this has a profound impact on the international system. So, if leaders do make a difference, what about all this realist stuff, that the international system forces states to behave in certain ways? A structural realist would argue you don't really need to know anything about the inside of a state except its ability to project power. Individuals may look at difference sometimes, but for the most part you can better predict the behavior of states by looking at its geographic location, economy, military, who its allies are. Tony Blair, or so the realists would argue, is the same as Bill Clinton, is the same as Saddam Hussein. Now, I think that there is a good argument that can be made for structural realism. So let me kind of illustrate to you what it is that I'm talking about. Now, I'm going to try to make the best possible case for structural realism here. I'm going to run out into the parking lot and then try to come back toward the door. If you notice, my path took a pretty obvious direction. I went essentially between the two cars in order to get to the door. Now, clearly there are other ways I might have gone. I could have tried to hop over the cars, climb over them, crawl under them, but the point is it's a lot easier for me to just simply go through. Well, the international system is a little bit like that, where there are structural impediments that prevent states from doing just anything they want to anytime they want. Can they go against the structures? Of course they can go against the structures, but it isn't necessarily the easiest thing, and it isn't always in the state's best interest to avoid following structures. Do individuals matter? The answer is sometimes. Sometimes the world forces us to act the same, in which George Bush is the same as Bill Clinton, is the same as Saddam Hussein. Sometimes we act differently. There are factors in which individuals can make a difference in foreign policy. First, there's the level of leadership. The higher your position is, the higher your office is, the more influence you have. A president can have more of an impact on foreign affairs than, say, the Secretary of State more than a bureaucrat. Second, there's level of interest. Leaders who are interested in foreign affairs have a greater impact than those who do not. Clinton had little interest in foreign affairs, at least early in his presidency. Bush Sr. and Reagan had a great interest. Finally, the more ambiguous the situation is, the more likely the individual is to play a part. The Cold War was fairly unambiguous. The Soviets were the rivals. Presidents felt the need to counter their influence. The invasion of Kosovo, for example, was an ambiguous situation. What to do, whether it's a security interest, is more up for debate. A president who has an opinion about this might affect whether or not the U.S. is involved. Trash man's here. It's getting kind of loud. Let's move it inside.